Hello, my name is Molly Phelps, community organizer at St. Francis Episcopal Parish and Community Center. This Easter season has given me an opportunity to reflect on what liberation means in the context of the resurrection, the work being done at St. Francis, and my experiences as a social worker. In Amy's sermon on Sunday, she reflected on how Easter demonstrates to us that things will never be the same again. We can never go back to the way that things used to be. Jesus' resurrection came as a disruption to what was expected and changed everything from that point forward. While I listened, I found myself thinking about how when we do things that we might feel ashamed of, or when we allow things to happen in the world that are too painful for us to acknowledge, that we are held back by the limits of our imaginations about what is really possible for us and for our world. I think we really have an opportunity to be able to take risks, to be vulnerable, and to allow ourselves to confront those things within us and in the world around us, things that might make us feel like we're irredeemable, and instead put our energy towards doing something about it. If God can receive the worst that we have to offer, and in return provide unconditional love, what is holding us back from being able to give that same gift to others? I think some of this comes from the fact that we get caught up in our own vices and we feel like we're trapped by them. I don't think that this is always conscious, but it does hold us back from being able to really engage with ourselves and others in a way that lets us be accountable for our actions and their impact. What happens if we take that a step further, though? Americanized Christianity in general tends to focus on individual sin and personal relationship with God and Christ, but not so much on collective sins of the world that we live in. So much of the greed and envy and other vices that we see are not just our own personal responsibility, but they exist in the very fabric of our society. They are amplified both in the damage that these sins unleash on the world, but also in the tendency that they have to replicate and reproduce themselves throughout history. Some of our collective American sins are genocide of the native peoples of this country, slavery, Jim Crow, disinvestment in communities of color, food apartheid, mass incarceration, relying on an economic system that means that we have to have an excess of unemployed people to have an excess workforce. I could go on. I think it's important to draw a parallel here about how Jesus' death and resurrection is also symbolic of the rejection of the systemic sins of his day. It wasn't just the sin of nailing Jesus to the cross, but the sin of the Roman Empire that required one of its citizens to engage in that act in the first place. The sin of oppression, of being hungry for power, of marginalizing groups of people, of trying to rule and control through acts of violence. Does any of this sound familiar? So I find myself wondering, if we are liberated from sin by the death and resurrection of Christ, why do we continue to allow these sins to be perpetuated within ourselves and within our systems and our society? What do we have to be afraid of? And what, then, does liberation look like in our modern social context? So, in my last video, I talked about ideology, how we unconsciously get stuck in patterns of normalizing things that are oppressive and violent, and how it can be really hard to separate those beliefs that we've inherited from our own selves. My intention for bringing it up at that point was to get us to a place where we could eventually talk about liberation of self and collective. It seems fortunate that Easter is conveniently upon us and allows us to reflect on liberation both spiritually and in practice. So I'll admit I'm not a theologian, but I am a social worker. Those of us who center liberation in social work practice do so from the belief that it is impossible to understand the problems that individuals and families face in isolation from political, cultural, economic, and historical conditions that contributed to those problems in the first place. We try to engage people that we work with about the ways in which personal, cultural, and institutional factors all contribute to the problems, and we attempt to empower them to use their agency to create change in those systems. In other words, liberatory social work attempts to look those collective sins we talked about earlier in the face and build resiliency and power in people to do something about them. We aim to liberate people both from internal and external oppression. So then, how would I define liberation in the context of social work and community organizing? We can't talk about liberation without acknowledging its root in radical Black feminism and Black liberation movements. There's also a lengthy tradition of holistic healing work and transformative justice within these movements that I think can point us towards some really great liberatory practices as well. Life as we know it in our society cannot exist without violence and dehumanization. These are tools that are used to legitimize and enforce oppression. Remember a few minutes ago when we talked about the sins of the Roman Empire. Furthermore, those of us who are part of the dominant culture are conditioned to believe that this is just the way that things are naturally. There's ideology again. In the philosophical sense, liberation is the shift of a person from an object to the subject. In other words, this is an act of humanization. Again, this is freedom from internal and external forces of oppression. In thinking about power, liberation is also the transition of power over to power to. Power over is the ability to get someone to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do, or to stop doing something that they might otherwise do, or change their preferences in a way that's actually contrary to their interest. This refers to the distinction between the ruler and the ruled. Power to, on the other hand, is a real possibility to do and to be. This really refers to the freedom of a person to have physical health, mental health, housing, safety, survival. In some ways, thinking about power to requires us to think about how we structure our lives, our beliefs and actions, and our society differently. In some ways, as we heard on Easter Sunday, it requires us to shift from telling stories about the way things are and reinforcing the status quo to stories that affirm what is possible. So I'll leave you with this thought. Ultimately, the first step towards liberation is the transformation of self. When we work to free ourselves from the chains of our own minds and imaginations, and our own sins, if you will, we can work towards the liberation of all and put what we've learned into practice to begin to undo the sins of the collective. We've already been given permission, and we've got a great example to live up to. Things will never be the same again.